Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On the morning of July 4th, 2011, Wayland, Massachusetts was waking to what should have been a holiday of barbecues and fireworks. Instead, the town was about to confront a crime scene that would leave scars far deeper than anyone could have predicted. Just after sunrise, a bicyclist riding along Water Row noticed something unnatural in the reeds of a marsh. He called 911. Within minutes, officers arrived and confirmed what no family should ever face: the body of 18-year-old Lauren Astley. Lauren wasn't just another teenager in this quiet Boston suburb. She had just graduated from Wayland High School, a student known for her involvement in chorus and for her future plans in college. She was artistic, outgoing, and widely liked among peers. For her friends and family, she was the person they thought would be setting off into the world with endless possibilities. That's why, when she didn't come home the night before, it raised alarm bells almost immediately. Her father had reported her missing early that morning after attempts to reach her went unanswered. The timeline was painfully clear. Lauren finished her work shift at the Natick Collection Mall on the evening of July 3rd. She was expected home, but never arrived. By the time her car was located at Wayland Town Beach, she was already missing. The missing person alert spread quickly, and before long, state and local police were involved in canvassing the area. The discovery along Water Row later that morning confirmed that this was no simple disappearance. The marsh itself became the first focal point of the investigation. Officers documented the scene carefully: shallow water, heavy reeds, and a body positioned in a way that indicated it had been left there, not simply a tragic accident. Early forensic checks pointed to strangulation and sharp force trauma, though full autopsy results would be needed for confirmation. What mattered that morning was the immediate reclassification of the case, from a missing person to a homicide. The area was sealed off, and crime scene protocols began. For investigators, the recovery of Lauren's body set off urgent questions. Who last saw her alive? Where had she gone after work? And how had she ended up in a marsh within her own hometown? This wasn't just another line in a case file. In small towns like Wayland, murders aren't just crimes. They cut through the fabric of a community that prides itself on safety. Detectives understood that every hour mattered, and every piece of evidence collected that morning might be the difference between clarity and a cold case. By midday on July 4th, the initial picture was stark. A young woman, last seen leaving work, reported missing, and found dead within hours. The marsh gave up the body, but not the full story. From there, the investigation shifted focus, from recovery to reconstruction. By the time the first patrol unit finished taping the perimeter at Water Row, the marsh had shifted from a search zone to a controlled recovery site. The response was methodical: a single ingress route for personnel, a staging area for equipment, a scene log started and maintained without gaps, photographs from fixed points before anything moved. In towns like Wayland, murders aren't just crimes. They interrupt a rhythm people rely on, and that's why the process here stayed exact. The body lay partly concealed by reeds in shallow water, close to the bank rather than mid-channel. Vegetation showed minimal disruption. No obvious drag furrows from the roadway. No field signs of a vehicle becoming stuck or turning around at the edge. These are small observations that carry weight. They help investigators decide whether a spot is an attack scene or a deposition site. The working posture formed quickly. The marsh read as recovery, not primary assault. By mid-morning, the medical examiner conducted a preliminary external exam on scene. The indicators were clear enough to guide the next steps without overreaching: ligature-type compression to the neck and a sharp force injury consistent with a cutting implement. There was no language on scene about cause of death undetermined. The path forward was to confirm findings through full autopsy and lab. The terms remained precise because in a case like this, imprecision costs time. Grid search teams moved outward from the recovery point. Evidence markers flagged small items embedded in silt and grass. A cord consistent with a bungee was located and packaged with standard anti-contamination protocols. Everything was labeled, sealed, and hand-carried to the staging table before transfer. No shortcuts. The scene text kept the chain of custody as clean as the tape line. If a jury ever needed to see this sequence, it would hold. Negative evidence has value, and it was logged. No shattered glass suggesting an on-site struggle, no pooled fluids, no discarded clothing that would suggest the assault happened at the water's edge. The shoreline lacked the kind of chaotic pattern that follows a fight. Things were quiet in a way that often means the violence occurred somewhere else. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, and the cue to widen the map. By early afternoon, the scene was fully documented. Recovery teams finished. The body was transported under escort to the medical examiner's office. Detectives briefed command with 3 immediate takeaways: the victim's identity as 18-year-old Lauren Astley, the condition of the body and visible injuries, and the emerging conclusion that the marsh almost certainly was not the primary location of the assault. That third point changed the assignment list. If the marsh was where the body was left, then the case would pivot to 2 fronts: reconstructing Lauren's last verified movements and isolating any location with evidence transfer, blood trace, footwear impressions, or items concealed after the fact. Investigators tightened the timeline, beginning with Lauren's end of shift at the Natick collection the prior evening. They flagged known travel corridors into Wayland and the town beach lot where her vehicle was located. They requested quick pulls on any municipal cameras and traffic-adjacent systems that might hold motion or license plate captures along those routes. At the same time, they began gathering statements from friends and family to anchor the clock with human observations: when she was expected, when texts stopped, who tried to reach her, and when. Nothing was speculated. Every entry was time-stamped and sourced. The victimology remained concise and relevant. Lauren had just graduated high school, was engaged in the arts, and had immediate plans for college. Those facts were not biography for color. They were context for why she would not have disappeared voluntarily overnight, and why family called in concern so quickly. In a suburban environment like this, out-of-pattern behavior is detectable fast. Early detection is how cases compress toward resolution rather than drift into long-term files. The Water Row site now served a second purpose: proving what it could not tell. If the assault didn't happen there, then the absence of typical scene artifacts, drag patterns from struggle, debris consistent with an attack, would help narrow the list of likely primary locations. That information would drive the search warrant work. It would also guide what to ask of digital forensics in the next phase: texts and calls preceding disappearance, any device activity that placed either the victim or persons of interest near locations of relevance, and social post before and after the homicide window. Each tool would be brought to bear, but only where the scene facts demanded it. The tone of the briefing to the family stayed professional and humane. Law enforcement confirmed Lauren had been found and that this was a homicide. No speculation, no commentary. Families deserve accuracy and dignity, especially when public attention rises quickly. Viewers sometimes ask why investigators speak sparingly at this point. The answer is simple: precise language protects the case, and precision protects the truth. By late afternoon, with the marsh cleared and the evidence secured, the focus moved. The next moves would be away from reeds and water and toward doors, rooms, cars, and devices, anywhere the physical and digital timelines could intersect with what was recovered. From there, the investigation would shift from scene to records. The recovery at Water Row set the clock. The next task was to rebuild the last hours of Lauren Astley's life from verifiable points: work schedule, travel corridors, phone and text activity, and the location of her vehicle. This wasn't guesswork. It was a controlled timeline designed to withstand courtroom scrutiny. Investigators began with the known anchor. Lauren completed her shift at the Natick collection on the evening of July 3rd. Management confirmed her schedule. Co-workers confirmed she left as expected. That established a departure window. From there, detectives mapped the practical route toward Wayland, arterial roads that locals use without thinking about it. Those roads do more than connect towns. They define opportunity and narrow the field to places a victim could realistically reach in a short span. Her car was located at the Wayland Town beach lot. That find mattered for 2 reasons. First, it placed her within Wayland after leaving the mall, closing the gap between Natick and the Water Row marsh where her body was later recovered. Second, it contradicted any early idea of a voluntary disappearance. People who leave on their own usually take their vehicle. Here, the vehicle stayed behind. That detail pushed the case deeper into a homicide posture and justified broader record pulls. Phone and text logs were requested through the usual legal channels. The goal wasn't to read private life, it was to establish activity patterns, last outgoing messages, last incoming messages, and when those exchanges stopped. The silence after a known endpoint often tells as much as the messages themselves. When a young adult who has plans, a job, and family contacts suddenly goes quiet, the absence is a data point. It compresses the time frame of risk and narrows where to look next. Detectives also canvassed the corridor between Natick and Wayland. Patrol units spoke with businesses that might have external cameras aimed at roadways, even if the systems were consumer-grade and retention short. The ask was simple: any motion captures or stills covering the evening window. Not all requests yield usable images, and investigators didn't assume they would here. But a timeline isn't built only from what's found. It's also built from what can be ruled out. No clear camera hits, placing Lauren at alternate destinations. No credible witness placing her outside the corridor. No evidence she left the area with someone for an unrelated plan. Friends and family were interviewed for context that had evidentiary value. Plans made for the holiday, messages sent and not returned, any intent to stop somewhere between the mall and home. Statements were logged with times and limited to what advanced the timeline. This stayed professional and focused. In a case like this, responsible victimology keeps the narrative tight. Recent graduate, active in the arts, routine, consistent, no documented history of disappearing overnight. Back at headquarters, the team aligned 3 tracks on a whiteboard: movement, communications, and vehicle location. Movement began at the mall and ended at the town beach lot. Communication showed normal contact into the evening, and then a drop-off that matched the period after work. The vehicle location stood alone, parked in town, not driven out of it. Individually, these elements were ordinary. Together, they pointed inward, toward a short radius in Wayland, not outward toward a highway or an airport. This is where sequencing matters. You do not jump to motive. You do not speculate about plans that aren't supported by records. The build is linear. A young woman left work, her car was found within her hometown, her phone activity went quiet, and by morning her body was recovered in a nearby marsh. In an investigative unit, that chain drives 2 decisions. First, expand canvas within the radius for any property tied to the victim by relationship, routine, or previous visits. Second, begin drafting targeted warrants that follow evidence transfer, clothing, footwear, items moved or concealed, and any digital artifacts that speak to planning or cover-up. The team also documented negative evidence as part of the record. No credible reports of Lauren seeking a late-night rideshare out of town. No bank activity consistent with travel. No texts indicating a trip or an emergency on her part. Negative evidence isn't filler. It closes doors on distracting theories and keeps resources aimed at where the facts lead. If viewers are asking what breaks a case like this open, the answer is often just that: clear boundaries created by what didn't happen. While the lab prepared to process materials from the recovery site, detectives prepared the next operational step: identifying a residence in Wayland with potential evidentiary value. That selection wasn't based on rumor or conjecture. It followed the timeline. Who was in contact with Lauren in the days leading up to July 3rd, who had proximity in town, and where a primary assault could have occurred out of public view. The objective was narrow: locate a scene that explains the injuries documented by the medical examiner and the absence of struggle indicators at the marsh. There was a human dimension here, handled carefully. Families want answers, and communities want assurances. Investigators gave neither until the facts could support them. The commitment, as always in a homicide, is to accuracy first. In suburbs like this, a single act of violence isn't just a crime. It destabilizes the sense of order people depend on. The only responsible response is disciplined fact-finding and a timeline that can stand up in court, not just on camera. By the end of this phase, the investigative posture was locked. Lauren left work as scheduled, arrived within Wayland, ceased known communications, and was recovered in the marsh hours later. The car at the town beach lot and the communications drop were the strongest anchors. With those established, detectives were ready to move from records to doors, to test whether a particular address in Wayland held the missing piece the marsh could not give. The bridge was direct and procedural. With the timeline set, the next step was a search warrant for a residence that aligned with proximity, relationship context, and the evidentiary gaps left by the recovery scene. The timeline pointed to a short radius in Wayland. Within hours of aligning those anchors, detectives obtained a narrowly tailored search warrant for a residence connected to Lauren by prior contact and proximity. The entry was controlled, single point of ingress, body-worn cameras rolling, and a scene log started as the first officer crossed the threshold. No assumptions, no narrative. Rooms would answer questions that the marsh could not. The house presented as orderly, doors and windows intact, no signs of forced entry relevant to the night Lauren disappeared. Those quiet anomalies matter. When a victim is known to a resident, access can be voluntary, which reshapes how investigators read the interior. A quick, protective sweep cleared occupants. The search then proceeded methodically, room by room, with photography before movement and packaging before removal. In the garage, examiners documented trace spots of apparent blood on a hard surface and around a utility sink. Swabs were taken, labeled, and sealed. The team avoided speculation or language implying any cleanup. The record shows collection, not conclusions. In a bedroom, a crawlspace access yielded concealed clothing consistent with female sizing. Items showed visible staining and adhered debris. Nearby, a bag contained a pair of sneakers with caked mud. A second pair showed staining consistent with blood. Each item was packaged in paper, sealed, and logged with unique identifiers. The chain of custody was unbroken from the moment of discovery to the staging table. Negative evidence was also recorded. No ransacked rooms, no destroyed fixtures, no household signs of a protracted struggle. That absence aligned with the recovery scene read at Water Row. Violence likely occurred away from public view, followed by deposition at the marsh. It also provided a practical roadmap, where to swab, what to luminol test, and which items to prioritize for serology and DNA typing. The goal was not volume, it was probative value that could withstand cross-examination. A second sweep focused on transfer materials. Technicians collected debris from the sneaker treads, lint from clothing, and trace from the garage floor. If those substrates contained pond silt or vegetative fragments similar to Water Row, that would support movement between the residence and the marsh. If the stains on clothing and shoes typed to Lauren, that would close distance between victim and interior. All of that would be decided in the lab, not in the hallway of the search. Investigators also recovered packaging materials and everyday cordage that, on their face, were common. The marsh had already yielded a cord consistent with a bungee. Items with superficial similarity found inside the house were placed into evidence for later comparison testing. The posture stayed cautious. Consistent with is not identical to. Lab work would speak for itself. In the kitchen and bathroom areas, drains and traps were sampled. The purpose was simple and legally routine: establish whether biological material consistent with the victim was present within the residence's plumbing. The reports would arrive later. Today's task was preservation. Elsewhere, bed linens and towels were collected only if they bore visible stains or forensic interest tied to the time window. The warrant scope was respected. A focused search preserves both evidence and the integrity of the case. By late afternoon, the evidence cart reflected a precise theory of relevance: stained female clothing from a concealed space, mud-bearing sneakers, swabs from a utility sink and selected hard surfaces, trace from the garage floor, and cords recovered for potential comparison. The transport officer signed for each item, and the lab intake was scheduled on a rush basis. In towns like this, one violent act is more than a crime. It fractures trust. The way to repair any of that is to let the facts lead and keep the record clean. Detectives briefed command with straight language. The house did not show forced entry. The interior produced clothing and footwear with visible staining and environmental transfer that could tie to the marsh. Apparent blood was collected for typing and DNA. Nothing about these findings required guessing. If testing confirmed victim DNA on any of it, the path forward would be narrow and strong. If it did not, the case would pivot accordingly. That is how a professional investigation protects both the innocent and the truth. Before leaving, the team executed a separate warrant for digital devices located on site. Those items were bagged for forensic imaging off premises, with hash values to verify data integrity. The devices themselves would not be explored inside the residence. That examination belongs to a lab bench with proper logging and tools. Digital artifacts, browser queries, message timestamps, social media actions would either corroborate planning and movement or undercut them. Either outcome has value when the goal is accuracy. The last task at the residence was community-facing, but brief. A supervisor confirmed to neighbors that officers had executed a court-authorized search and that the investigation was ongoing. No names were released, no commentary on motive. Silence here is not evasive, it's ethical. Families deserve to learn findings from investigators, not rumors. And the public deserves a case file built on evidence, not speculation. As the evidence van rolled, the case crossed a line. The marsh had offered the fact of death. The house offered potential links to the act. From this point, the center of gravity would shift to the laboratory. Serology, DNA typing, trace comparison, and the first pass at digital forensics. If the results stacked the way the scene suggested, the investigation would move from probable cause to a charging posture. If not, the same results would help eliminate error and redirect resources. Either way, the next hours belonged to analysts. The evidence left the house and the marsh in sealed paper and hard cases. Within hours, it reached the state lab. Intake was quiet and exact, seals inspected, barcodes scanned, forms signed. By late afternoon, triage began. Stained garments from the crawl space went to serology. Swabs from the utility sink and select hard surfaces queued behind them. In a separate room, the seized devices were imaged and hashed, so whatever came next could be defended in court, not just discussed in a briefing. Results started to land before the week turned over. Serology called the first play. Human blood on the concealed clothing. DNA comparison followed, matching the victim's reference profile. That single line on the report did what the marsh could not. It placed Lauren inside the residence by science, not inference. Trace examiners moved in parallel on the mud-caked sneakers, isolating silt and plant fragments and comparing them to control samples from water row. The language stayed conservative, consistent with the marsh environment, not unique to it, but in a homicide, consistent is a direction of travel. The medical examiner's final report tightened the edges. Cause of death was ligature strangulation with a cutting injury to the neck. Those words were clinical, but they mattered. They aligned with what detectives had observed during recovery and with the cord collected at the shoreline. If the marsh was where the body was left, the residence was now the best candidate for where the assault began. The working map narrowed from an entire town to a single set of rooms. Digital forensics answered questions that bricks and mortar could not. Examiners verified device hashes and began the slow work of artifact review. A browser entry touching on fingerprints appeared inside the relevant window. A social media account tied to the residence joined an online Find Lauren group after the point at which she could no longer act for herself. And on their own, those clicks could be dismissed as noise. Against a lab stack, victim DNA on concealed clothing, marsh consistent trace on footwear, and a tight movement timeline, they read as posturing after a homicide, a crime that someone inside that house knew more about than they were saying. The negative space in the record stayed important. There was no late-night bank or ATM activity by Lauren, no rideshare charges, no travel bookings. Her phone showed normal behavior into the evening and then stopped. No forced entry at the residence meant access could have been voluntary. None of that proved who did what. All of it kept the case from drifting toward theories that didn't belong. By early evening, detectives met with the lab and the prosecutor's office to translate evidence into elements. First-degree murder in Massachusetts turns on intentional killing with premeditation or extreme atrocity. The facts on the table were simple but strong. The victim's blood on clothing hidden in a bedroom crawlspace. Footwear with environmental transfer consistent with the deposition site. Autopsy establishing ligature strangulation plus a cutting injury. Digital artifacts that looked like awareness masquerading as concern. The task wasn't to narrate. It was to decide whether that stack, together with the timeline already built, met the threshold for charges. Analysts signed affidavits. Chain of custody logs were double-checked for gaps. Detectives began drafting a probable cause statement that would hold up to scrutiny, sticking to the language of the reports and the timestamps. Motive wouldn't lead the document, evidence would. If a jury ever read that paper, they would see a sequence, not a story. Work shift, car in town, silent phone, body in the marsh, residence with the victim's blood on concealed clothing, and device activity that didn't fit the role of a bystander. There was one more practical step before the file moved forward. Investigators requested expedited comparisons between the cordage from the shoreline and items collected inside the residence. No overpromising, just a clean request and a deadline. If the comparison strengthened the link, it would be added to the charging packet. If it did not, nothing about the existing posture changed. In disciplined cases, labs don't rescue weak files. They confirm strong ones. The day closed without theatrics. No press conference, no speculation. Families deserve answers and communities deserve accuracy. But the system works best when facts go first. From here, the pathway was narrow. Finalize the charging theory, seek the warrants that follow, and prepare for arraignment. The gravity of the case didn't come from how it was told. It came from how it was built. The lab packets went back across the river and onto a conference table. Within minutes, detectives briefed the district attorney's team line by line. No color, just reports. The sequence held. Lauren Astley leaves work in the evening. Her car is found in town. Her phone goes quiet. Her body is recovered at Water Row, and a residence yields concealed clothing, with her blood and footwear bearing trace consistent with the marsh. A browser artifact touches on fingerprints inside the window, and a post-homicide social action ties back to that same address. Later that afternoon, the call is made. The case moves from investigation to charging. Probable cause isn't a story. It's a scaffold. Detectives drafted the affidavit in clean, chronological order. They cited the autopsy, ligature strangulation with a cutting injury, and the DNA match on the hidden clothing. They referenced the negative space, no forced entry at the residence, no late-night banking by the victim, no travel transactions, no verified sightings outside the Natick to Wayland corridor. They attached chain of custody logs and analyst affidavits. When the judge signed the warrant, service followed without incident. The person at the center of the affidavit was transported, booked, and held. Arraignment came quickly. In the district court, the Commonwealth charged murder and requested that the defendant be held without bail. The presentation was tight: lab confirmations, recovery posture at Water Row, residence-based evidence, and digital artifacts that do not read like the timeline of an uninvolved bystander in a homicide. Defense reserved arguments. The bench ordered the hold. Later that week, the matter began its move toward a Middlesex County grand jury for indictment and trial in Superior Court at Woburn. With the charging posture formal, the file was audited for gaps. Investigators sent an expedited request for comparative testing between the cordage recovered at the shoreline and items seized at the residence. They issued preservation notices for any remaining accounts or devices linked to the address, ensuring timestamps would be admissible. They flagged witnesses in a logical order for a future courtroom: discovery bicyclist, patrol response, medical examiner, crime scene techs, lab analysts, and finally, the digital examiner. A homicide is a crime that lives or dies on sequence. A jury must see evidence in the same order the facts were built. Naming the defendant is not a twist, it is a record. The person charged in this case is Nathaniel Fujita of Wayland, Massachusetts. The indictment to come would refine counts and legal language, but the core would not change. A young woman's last hours were anchored by documents and timestamps, not speculation, and those anchors led to a single address and a single defendant. Before the file left the Detective Bureau for the prosecutor's long shelf, there was one more meeting with Lauren's family. The update was calibrated and humane. Charges filed. Defendant held. The system is deliberate by design. It protects the truth by moving in steps that withstand appeal. Families deserve that more than they deserve speed. From here, the venue shifts again. Discovery begins. Motions, calendar fills. The same facts will be translated into exhibits, testimony, and jury instructions. If the investigative work has been disciplined, the courtroom will feel inevitable, not dramatic. That is how a strong case reaches a verdict. Jury selection ended by mid-morning in Woburn. Within minutes, the Commonwealth walked the panel through a clean sequence: a missing person call at daybreak, a body recovered along Water Row, a home in Wayland that produced concealed clothing stained with the victim's blood, and devices preserving a browser artifact about fingerprints plus a social media action after the victim could no longer act. No flourishes, just a timeline the jurors could hold. The first witness was the bicyclist. He described the stop along Water Row and the 911 call placed immediately after he saw what he could not dismiss. The responding officer followed, confirming how the marsh was taped, logged, and held as a recovery site. The crime scene examiner then authenticated the photographs in the grid search notes, explaining why the shoreline read as deposition rather than assault. Minimal disturbance, no drag furrows from the roadway, and no pooled fluids that would indicate a fight at the water's edge. Each answer landed with a document on the screen and an exhibit number to match. The medical examiner took the stand before lunch. Cause of death was set out in precise terms: ligature strangulation with a cutting injury to the neck. The testimony was short and clinical. It linked the injuries to what officers had observed at the recovery site and to a cord documented there. Jurors now had the language that trials depend on, and the court moved on. Forensic analysts came next. The serology and DNA examiner identified the clothing recovered from a bedroom crawl space at the Wayland residence and stated, without hedging, that the blood on those garments matched the victim. The chain of custody was shown step by step: who sealed the bag, who broke the seal at intake, who cut the samples, and how controls ruled out contamination. The trace examiner followed, describing sediment and vegetative fragments found in sneaker treads and why those materials were consistent with the Water Row marsh. The language stayed conservative. Consistent with never became unique to. Jurors learned what the finding did and did not prove. Digital evidence was presented with the same discipline. The examiner authenticated imaging by showing hash values created at intake and then again at review. So the panel understood that the screenshots they saw were identical to the data taken from the device. A browser artifact touching on fingerprints fell inside the relevant window. A social media account tied to the residence joined a Find Lauren group after the period when Lauren's phone activity had already gone quiet. The examiner did not guess at motive or tone. The timestamps were the testimony. Friends and classmates provided limited context that mattered to sequence: the recent breakup, the pattern of normal texting into the evening, and the abrupt silence afterward. The prosecutor kept their testimony inside the rails. No character speeches, no speculation. The point was to show why a voluntary disappearance did not fit the facts, and why the search moved quickly from welfare check to homicide posture. In towns like this, a single violent act is not just a crime. It ruptures routine, and jurors understand routine. Cross-examination targeted the edges. Defense counsel pressed on chain of custody for the crawlspace clothing and whether any gap occurred between seizure and lab bench. The analyst answered with signatures and timestamps. Counsel challenged the weight of the trace finding and asked whether other marshes could show similar material. The answer was yes. That is why the conclusion remained consistent with. On the digital side, counsel asked whether someone other than the device owner could have performed the fingerprint query. The examiner acknowledged technical possibilities in the abstract but returned to who possessed the device and when. By late week, the Commonwealth organized the stack in the order it had been built: last shift at the Natick collection, car at the town beach lot, phone and text silence, recovery along Water Row, and a residence that produced the victim's DNA on hidden clothing, footwear with marsh-consistent trace, and digital actions that fit knowledge rather than ignorance. The jurors saw the same timeline the detectives had assembled: linear, document-backed, and narrow. When the prosecution rested, it did so without theatrics. The case they presented was not about a story. It was about sequence, procedures, and corroboration. What came next would be the defense case and the question of mental state. That shift would change the lens but not the record. The prosecution of Nathaniel Fuja in Massachusetts began in 2013, 2 years after the killing of Lauren Ashley. By the time the trial opened, the case file was solid. Physical evidence from the swamp where Lauren's body was recovered, clothing fibers, DNA transfer, and witness statements placing Nathaniel with her that night. Jurors were shown how Lauren had attempted to separate herself from a relationship marked by jealousy and aggression, only to have her decision met with fatal violence. In court, the defense argued that Nathaniel's mental health had deteriorated following a head injury sustained in sports, pointing to depression and impaired judgment. Psychiatric evaluations were entered into the record, but they did not outweigh the sequence of deliberate actions proven by investigators: Lauren visiting his residence, her abrupt disappearance, and the recovery of her body in a concealed area nearby. The working theory that this was a crime of retaliation was supported by text messages, witness testimony about prior threats, and forensic matches from Nathaniel's home. The prosecution's closing argument left little ambiguity. They emphasized that while emotional struggles may exist, they do not excuse premeditated crime. Evidence showed intent, preparation, and execution consistent with first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a unanimous verdict. Nathaniel Fuja was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Lauren's family, the sentence confirmed accountability, though it could not restore what was lost. She was remembered in statements as an intelligent young woman, committed to her studies and her art, whose future was taken by an act of violence that was both avoidable and devastating. The case remains a reminder of the critical importance of early intervention in relationships marked by control and intimidation. Nathaniel Fuja is serving life in prison without parole for the murder of Lauren Ashley, a case that stands as a stark example of how unchecked violence can escalate into irreversible crime. As I close this case, I want to step back and reflect, not only on Lauren's tragedy, but on what it teaches us. Violence in relationships rarely begins with something extreme. It often starts with control, jealousy, and manipulation. When we ignore those warning signs, the outcome can be devastating. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is that silence protects no one. Speaking up, asking for help, and intervening early can save lives. I share these stories not just as crime reports, but as reminders that each of us has a role in building safer communities. Lauren's name deserves to live on as a call for awareness and responsibility.
Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts after hearing this story? Do you believe communities today are doing enough to protect young people from relationship violence? Leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from, or share your perspective so we can keep this dialogue alive. And if this video moved you, or even challenged you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll be here with us for the next true crime story that not only documents what happened, but also reminds us why it matters.